What really happened in 1929 and why does it still matter? Nearly a century after the most devastating crash in American history, DealBook founder, New York Times reporter, and CNBC host Andrew Ross Sorkin has unearthed the human story behind it, the ambition, the greed, the blind faith that the boom would never end. In his new book, 1929, Sorkin shows how that era's delusion still echoes today in our markets, our tech obsessions, even our politics. We're going to be talking about what history can teach us about capitalism, risk, and our endless belief that this time it will be different. Andrew, I'm so happy to see
Thank you
you.
for having me. I'm so excited to do this with you.
First of all, when I saw this book, I heard about this book, and then I actually put the book on my scale.
Yeah.
I thought, how the hell did you find time to write this? You are the busiest human being on the planet. You do Squawk Box on CNBC every morning. You write fantastic articles for the New York Times. You do DealBook, a newsletter. You do the DealBook live event.
Right.
What the hell?
It took me 8 years. That's the answer. I don't play golf. I don't do other things. I do have 3 children and
I
a
know you
wife,
do.
who are so happy that this book is over, by
I'm
the way.
sure.
But I would do this on airplanes, on weekends, at nights. I would be sneaking little time in at any moment I possibly could.
So, what was it about 1929, Andrew? I mean, you have a choice to write about so many different interesting moments in history and what's happening today, too,
Right.
because the world is just exploding. So, how did you decide, gosh, I really want to write about this one specific year?
So I'm always chasing interesting, which oftentimes means chasing failure. And no, because I oftentimes think that's where the most drama is. It's where the most interesting characters are. It's where we can try to understand things that we do well and things where we may need to do better. And I had written this book, Too Big to Fail, in 2008 about the financial crisis then. And people used to ask me about 1929 and say, how does 2008 compare to 1929? And I'd always be like, I don't know. I think, like most Americans, we knew something very terrible happened in 1929. We also have a vague notion that the Great Depression happened then, the stock market fell. But I didn't know who the people were, what they were saying to each other, what their motivations were, what their incentives were, who's sleeping with who, what's going on here. I mean, I really wanted to know these things. And so I went on a vacation actually with my wife, like a real nerd, and I brought all these books with me about different characters in 1929, da, da, da. And they were all written in sort of the 1930s, 40s. One of the most famous books was written in the 50s, mostly by economists, sort of talking about them in sort of economic terms and structures and charts and all of these things. And I sort of walked away saying, there's got to be more to this.
More human drama,
more
right?
human drama. Look, the books that I always loved were things like, Den of Thieves or Barbarians at the Gate. These were sort of these great dramas about business where you felt like you were watching a movie. And I thought, I wonder if I could do that. And I happened to be at Harvard University giving a speech. And I got there early, which you know me well enough to know I'm never anywhere early. And I get to the library. So I have this extra time. I walk into the library there at Baker Library, and I say to the archivist, can I look at these boxes you have from the late 20s, early 30s? And there was a guy named Thomas Lamont who was running J.P. Morgan then. And his family had donated all of his papers, his letters, his diaries, and all the things. And I open up this box, and there are these transcripts in the box of his conversations. His secretary would keep these transcripts of him conversing with Roosevelt and Hoover. And it would literally be, it was a transcript. So it would say what he said and what the president said. And I thought, wow, I hadn't read this in any of the books. And they're talking about all of the things that are actually happening. And by the way, not to bring this to today, these conversations are like the conversations that like all these CEOs are now having with Trump all the time.
And we're going to talk about the parallels.
But I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness, okay, could I take that kind of material and do this writ large? Now, the truth is the archivist said to me that she had read Too Big to Fail, and she said, you're not going to be able to do this book. This doesn't exist because the material is not there. It's there for this guy, but the other people, you're gonna struggle.
And you took that as a challenge.
I took that as I didn't want to believe her. Now, by the way, she was partially right, and it wasn't that she was right. It was that I think most historians sort of find 2 or 3 or 4 archives, and then they excavate the archive, and they really just go deep in the archive. The challenge in this case was there really wasn't like 1 or 2 or 3 places you could go. It was you had to be like needle in a haystack situation with 15, 20, 30 different places. And you'd almost have to guess. You'd almost have to say, okay, well, my character I don't have an archive for this character, but he might have called somebody or talked to someone after. Well, who are the 12 people he might have talked to? Okay, I'm now going to go to their archives and then pray to God that I'm going to find some letter there. And sometimes you would, and sometimes you wouldn't.
Tracking all this stuff down sounds like it was more than a full-time job. And I know that you enlisted these grad students during COVID,
yes.
Right? So talk about, I mean, honestly, just thinking about how overwhelming this task was, how you were able to track all this stuff down.
Well, so one of the things I did, and this was sort of maybe the mother of invention during COVID, I had been going to a lot of these libraries. I had a researcher who I'd worked with early on and was planning to spend the time in the stacks. And I ultimately did, by the way, spend an extraordinary amount of time, maybe too much time in the stacks. But during COVID, you weren't allowed in. So we would call the librarians and say, is there any student who's allowed in the library? Sometimes they had a dissertation or a thesis that was due, and so they were allowed, those like very select students were allowed in. And so I would then pay the students.
How did you find them, by the way?
The librarian would usually say, "Well, I'll give you some emails of some people."
This was like a covert operation.
And then you'd pay them, and then you'd say, "Please, I want you to take a picture. I want you to find box 152 or whatever it is, and I need you to take a picture of every page in 152. We'll set up these these sort of elaborate Dropbox folders, and then you'd read it. It was a very tedious process, but it was actually quite helpful, I have to say.
I mean, how many grad students did you work with? And I hope you acknowledge them in the book. Did you?
Yes, a bunch of them I do. A handful. I only a handful. And then the truth is that after the pandemic was over, I oftentimes found myself back at a lot of the same libraries, because one of the things I really did learn was you almost felt like you needed to see everything because you were worried that something was missed. Maybe there was a box that you didn't know to look in. Certain boxes are I didn't know about all this history stuff. Some boxes are indexed, so people know what's in them. Some boxes have because nobody knows what's in them, and sometimes people, as a result, don't even look. And that's where the great sort of needle in a haystack situation comes into play, because sometimes you'll land on something and go, that's amazing.
Now I understand the 8-year process. So you amass all this original research, Andrew, and you read it, you learn about all these specific characters, and you write this tome about the year. And I'm curious, like, as you read and sifted through all these stories, what was the theme? Like, what surfaced that made you think this would make such a compelling story? And what was that story?
I think the animating idea for me was the people themselves, sort of the human condition, and what was happening in the 1920s was just so fascinating to me, in that this was like a boom like nothing we'd ever seen. Maybe it's a boom like today we're having with AI or something, but it was like a generational shift in the whole country. So prior to 1919, nobody ever took credit. Nobody borrowed money. It was considered a moral sin in America to borrow money. Like, you just wouldn't do that. General Motors started doing that actually to help them sell more cars, and then Sears Roebuck clocked what was happening and said, okay, we should do that for appliances. And then a guy named Charlie Mitchell, who ran a bank called National City, which later on becomes Citigroup, which you know now, said, okay, well, we can do this too. We're going to lend people money so that they can buy stocks. And there was this explosion. I mean, all of these people became celebrities, business people, CEOs. All this was the celebrity. All the things that are happening now with Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Jamie Dimon. That really started in the 1920s.
And it was all because of credit.
And it was all because of credit, because all of a sudden everybody could gamble. And brokerage houses start emerging on the corners of streets like the way there's Starbucks today. I mean, they're just everywhere. And you could go in and you could literally give them $1. If you put down $1, they would lend you $10. So as the market's going up, and by the way, when I say the market's going up, it's not like going up 10% a year. In 1928, so the year before 1929, the market went up 48%. By September of 1929, the market was up 90%. So this was like free money. And people, they feel wealthy, they're running around, they're doing all of these crazy things. And it was just so fascinating to see, I don't want to say greed, but I think that the human condition is to want more. Everybody wants more. And people knew that this was getting out of hand. It wasn't that nobody was saying, this isn't crazy. There were Cassandras in the room, but nobody really wanted to stop it. The party was going, the drinks were flowing. You know what I mean?
The wealth was growing.
There's a great line. It actually happened right before the financial crisis in 2008. A guy named Chuck Prince, who was actually the CEO of Citigroup, said, when the music's playing, you have to dance. And these folks in the 1920s, they were dancing. And I thought it was so interesting to see all of those component parts and then to see the mistakes that they were making along the way. And the story also goes in many ways actually beyond 1920. I mean, 1929 is sort of the pivotal domino, but the story really goes through the end of 1933, the summer of 1933, because, and I think that will also maybe change your impression of 1929. People think like there was some kind of great crash, the Great Depression happens. That's not really what happens. It's like there's a series of crashes, actually, and then a series of terrible decisions that get made in Washington, oftentimes in conjunction with the CEOs and bankers who are trying to influence the president and tell them crazy things, that really lead to what ultimately turns into the Great Depression.
Before we talk about this moment, actually two moments in 1929 and what happened in those bad decisions, I'm fascinated by the Roaring Twenties,
Right.
and was this kind of, environment or atmosphere where everybody was like going crazy and living large.
Yes.
Was that impacting everyone or only a certain segment of society?
It's a great question. So the inequality was real in 1929, very similar to now. But I do think all of this was sort of under the guise of democratizing finance. So you did have the quote-unquote ordinary American going into these effectively gambling salons, otherwise known as brokerages, to try to participate in this dream. There was this almost lottery-like idea. It was also, by the way, a real shift in what I even describe as the American dream. Prior to this period, people really did talk about the sort of Horatio Alger story being the American dream. The sort of get-rich-quick fantasy of capitalism, or whatever, however you want to describe it, that was a phenomenon of the 1920s. So people really, and there was also a technological shift too happening. So, here we are on a podcast with video. The hottest stock in the 1920s was ticker symbol radio.
I knew you were going to say that.
I was going to say
yeah.
RCA. And that was like the NVIDIA of its time or something. And everybody was going crazy because they thought this is going to change the world, just the way we thought the internet was going to change the world, just the way we think AI is going to change the world.
It's amazing how many similarities, and I do want to talk about that in a moment. But first, I want to hear about some of the characters that you really learn about and that you profiled and whose diaries you read,
Yes.
et cetera, and letters. So I think a lot of people think, Hoover, Roosevelt, and maybe Carter Glass when they think of this whole episode in American history. But let's talk about some of the others that are less known but will be now because of your book. Thomas Lamont, managing partner at J.P. Morgan. Just tell us quickly about him.
Okay, so J.P. Morgan was considered like the most important bank in the country. Still was then. He really was the guy running the bank. So a guy named Jack Morgan, the son of J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan had died at this point. Was ostensibly the CEO, but Thomas Lamont was really the man who ran the bank, and he was the ultimate sort of client guy. He believed that if you could just get a bunch of people in a room, like the right people, you could control the world. And he would have dinner with Hitler and with Mussolini and with Roosevelt and with Hoover. This guy was he was everywhere and everything. He was befriending all the journalists. So he was
Schmoozer in chief.
Schmoozer in chief. He was whispering in everybody's ears. This was that guy. And the truth is, he tried to control this thing, but it sort of got away from him. So he did believe that somehow he could keep all of this from bubbling over. And then October of 1929 comes around, he gets the people in the room, and it doesn't work.
I want to know what happened on that day, but first let me
Yep.
go through a couple more characters. Charles Sunshine Charlie Mitchell, CEO of National City Bank. You mentioned him earlier.
Charlie is my favorite character in the book. And Charlie really did.
You feel like you know him, right?
I feel like I know Charlie. Charlie ran, as I said, the bank that becomes Citigroup. He was the Jamie Dimon of his time. I mean, he was as famous as Jamie Dimon runs J.P. Morgan today, but he's probably the most famous banker in America, in the world. He invented the idea. He was the one who said, okay, we should lend money to folks to buy stock. He was called Sunshine Charlie because he would tell anybody who would listen to him that everything was always going to be better. He always had a smile on his face. At all times, that was sort of his job and his way. And he gets, I don't want to give away what happens, but he does something, he does a little side deal at one point with his wife, who gets involved in this whole thing. And let's just say that the police show up at his house at one point, and he gets handcuffed. We won't say what happens after that.
He wasn't so sunshiny at that point.
At that point. That happened in 1933, so it took a while for things to catch up to him.
The other one is Jesse Livermore. Poor Jesse Livermore, right?
Poor Jesse Livermore. So one of the other thing that, I mean, look, I know this probably sounds like a book about the economy. It's kind of like a crazy drama. So Jesse Livermore is a emotionally tortured short seller. This is somebody who bets against stock. And he was famous in the 20s for betting against stock and winning. He almost is basically out of business by 1928 and 29 because the stock market keeps going up and up and up. He's losing his shirt because you can't bet stocks are going down during this period. And he magically comes back and makes a crazy trade in the fall of 1929, walks away with $100+ million, which, by the way, within a year or two, he had summarily lost again. He was sort of
Addicted?
Addicted. You might describe as like degenerate gambler of sorts. And I will give away the ending. He ultimately, in 1941, walks into what was then the cloakroom at the Sherry Netherland up on Fifth Avenue near the Apple Store.
Right.
You know, the Apple Store wasn't there back then. And he shoots himself in the head and kills himself. So there's actually a number of suicides that take place during this whole period.
Well, there
bunch of people who jump out of windows,
right.
and
I mean, I think that people who don't know that much about the crash, I think that's what they always think of: people jumping out of windows, people losing their wealth in a matter of minutes, right?
So my grandfather, Sidney Sorkin, who's no longer alive, lived till he was 91 years old. He was down there in October of 1929. His brother was a messenger boy, and I think he was 11. He went with his older brother down there, and he used to tell us a story about how he saw somebody jump out of a window in October of 1929.
Wow.
And he never in his whole 91 years bought a share of stock in the stock market.
Interesting.
It was a generationally scarring event for him. I think he bought bonds. Maybe he had some mutual funds. I don't know. But stock, like individuals say, he always thought the stock market was like this place for gamblers because of this sort of formidable experience he had. But I think a lot of Americans had that. Interestingly,
my dad too, by the way. You know, when I was starting to make some money and TV news, my dad was always like muni bonds. He really like wanted something super safe and secure. And thinking about that, my dad was born in 1920. So I think probably like your grandfather, he had the same scarring experience, even if it was from afar, right?
Now, weirdly, I should note, just to be factual as a journalist, one of the more interesting things that I did learn is that actually from a data perspective, there were actually not more suicides in 1929 than there were the year before.
Oh, wow.
So there's sort of this impression that that everybody's jumping out the window.
No, but I guess because it was so dramatic
Right.
that it has been overblown in
Right.
retrospect, right?
Yeah.
That is interesting.
And I think also in the moment, to the extent there were suicides, they were more dramatic. There were people shooting themselves in the head. They were jumping out of windows. It was and they were being covered in the newspapers constantly because oftentimes if you read the article about somebody committing suicide, it was also about how they had lost their fortune or lost all their money or had to mortgage their home.
And maybe it was in a sort of truncated period of time, Andrew, so maybe there weren't more, but maybe
Right.
it was in a limited time span.
Yeah.
I don't know. Get on that, will you?
I will.
All right, the book opens with Charles Sunshine Charlie Mitchell, the CEO of National City Bank, returning to his office
Yep.
at 55 Wall Street on October 28th,
Yes.
1929, hours after the market had closed, with a 13% drop.
Mm-hmm.
What happens next?
Well, Charlie finds out that while he was out of the office all day, he had joined the board of the New York Fed. While he was out at these emergency meetings, that his trader had bought a whole ton of stock in the bank itself, and they didn't have the money to buy the stock. So you know how companies buy their own stock.
Mm-hmm.
So back then, companies did the same thing. The problem was that during especially these sort of crazy periods in October of 29, the stock market, like if you looked at the board of the stock prices on the exchange back then, they were oftentimes like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 hours behind what was actually happening in reality. And so people were buying stocks not understanding what the prices were. And so they effectively bought $30+ million worth of their stock, and they couldn't afford it, which put him in this position of trying to figure out, what am I going to do to try to save the bank without anybody knowing that they had done this. He all of a sudden has this sort of existential crisis, and well, I don't know if I want to give away what happens.
Well, just
next,
give a little, just give a little
so,
bit.
And
People will still buy the book.
No. One of the things that he does is effectively he goes and he decides he's going to put this whole thing on his back. He goes to J.P. Morgan to try to get them to give him a loan, and for him to buy the stock off of the bank, because he didn't want anyone to know that the bank would have otherwise been in trouble. And that decision, that sort of secret decision, turns into a sort of bigger problem for him later, because he then tries to do some sort of tax shenanigans with his wife, let's just say, that leads to his arrest.
So you, I know, say that, I think when we imagine this crash, right?
Yep.
We think of a crash.
You think one day.
Something,
This is not really one day. It's like
boom.
multiple days.
And
Yeah.
you say it wasn't a moment, it was a relentless unraveling.
Right.
Talk about that.
Well, so the very strange thing is that despite the market going down, 40, 50% between September or end of September and November, by the end of the year, and this is the part that most people probably would never even imagine, by the end of the year, the stock market was only down 17%. And so there was this sort of relief thing happening, except that all of these people had lost their money in the process. And I think the one thing to think that about with this stock market, which is just so different than it is today, when the stock market goes down today, people say, oh, well, I bought the stock at $50 and now the stock's at $30, so I lost $20 a share. Not good. But what was happening is most people had borrowed all the money to buy the stock. So it wasn't just that you lost the $20. It was that you owed the bank oftentimes like $100 because and so people are going into hock. I mean, there's a great little scene that I sort of landed on with Groucho Marx, who at that point was not actually famous or really that famous yet. And he was out in Long Island. He was pretty conservative, according to his son, with his money, but he was spending like all day long at this brokerage house in Long Island just following the tape, like constantly. That's what he did. It was like
smoking a cigar,
smoking cigars and following the tape. And he actually was a very smart guy. He was questioning his broker about whether he should buy RCA. Why is RCA not giving out dividends? Well, they weren't giving out dividends because they don't have any cash. But the brokers were like, this time is different. If you don't do this, you're going to lose out. Trust me, I do it too. We're all doing this. Well, he gets a call in October of 1929, says, you got to get down here, and you're going to have to pay off the loan. He ends up having to mortgage his own home to deal with it all. And I think that was sort of just a little like microcosm of a story of what was happening everywhere.
Talk a little bit more about sort of the relentless unraveling, if you will, Andrew. So you have, I mean, just give us a little timestamp of all these events.
Well, I don't know how far we want to go. I mean, most of the real action happens in October in terms of the market crash. However, as I said, there's sort of a series of dominoes. So the country is sort of losing its shirt in late 1929. Market starts actually coming back a little bit, but the economy is not really coming back. And so there's a big question is, what is President Hoover going to do? What is the government going to do? Talk about bad decisions. So President Hoover's Treasury Secretary then was a guy named Andrew Mellon, who you may have heard of. And Andrew Mellon was a true capitalist. His view was, if you trade and you lose, you lose. We're not helping you. We're not bailing you out. Screw you. Hoover had this sort of view that somehow the economy and the stock market were like separated, that they weren't really connected to each other, and this was almost like a psychological problem, and that if you could just get the country over the sort of psychological problem, that somehow you'd be in a better place. But he also wanted to raise taxes at that time, probably not the best decision. He then decides to implement tariffs. Again, what's happening in America today? Tariffs. So he implements in 1930 something called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. A year later, global trade is down 60% back then. And by the way, same thing as now. 1,000 economists wrote an open letter to Hoover begging him not to do this. But he had run on this because he wanted to get the farmers in the middle of the country to vote for him, and he wanted to, make good on his promise. So there were just sort of a series of these things. But of course, by 1933, even before that, you started to have what's called Hoovervilles were emerging. These were like tented camps, even including
in D.C.
In D.C., also in Central Park. There were tented camps in Central Park, literally blocks away from Charles Mitchell's house. Charles Mitchell lived, you know New York very well, up on 5th Avenue and 75th Street, the French consulate.
Uh-huh.
That was his house. That's where he lived. They lived in these they were like kings. They lived in these mansions. They were castles. And so, Hoovervilles were emerging. And so you had this sort of, those were sort of the series of dominoes of things that really, I think, put the country in a very, very tough place.
It's amazing when you think about the culture of the 20s, obviously, and this, I'm sure, struck you time and time again as you're writing this book, Andrew, and what we're seeing today in terms of the economic climate, sort of income inequality, a laissez-faire regulatory policy mood, investors and innovators becoming celebrities.
Yes.
And as I mentioned, widening inequality. Were you like, holy shit?
Yeah.
We are ripe for something like this to happen? Or how did you square the similarities between these two periods?
I should just say straight up, when I started the project, I didn't think that I was writing about today. Like, that was not really the goal. And by the way, there's nowhere in the book, as you know, where I say, hey, like this is like this.
Right.
But as I'm writing the book, I would say, especially in the last couple of years, I'd be like, oh, okay, the tariff thing is happening. The tariff thing is happening. This idea of democratizing finance is happening. It's happening. We're going to take some of the guardrails and rules away. And you realize, by the way, in the 1920s, there were no rules. Literally no rules. There was no SEC, insider trading. All these stocks are being manipulated like crazy back then. And here we are right now trying to take these rules away, trying to take transparency away.
The tech titans are meeting at the White House.
All of this, so many of the sort of same component parts of this. And also, I would argue even now with, I don't know if you call it a bubble, but sort of here we are in this sort of like AI revolution. Feels a little bit like the radio revolution. People are betting massive quantities of money using leverage, using debt, and it's happening all over again. And there's also this idea of the lottery ticket. So right now, Trump just implemented a new law that effectively is going to allow the venture capital guys and the private equity guys and the private credit guys to literally sell product to the ordinary investor for the first time. This stuff's going to end up in people's retirement accounts for the first time, like your 401k account, is now going to have access to these things, which we never allowed before because we thought it was too risky. But now we're saying it's not too risky.
And why is that happening? I don't quite understand that. Does that also have to do with the government and intel and sort of, or is that a different thing?
I think it's a different thing. I think it's the idea, and this was a very 1920s-ish idea, that the elites were making all of this money and that the little guy had no access. So it is true that folks who've had access to buy shares of Uber or Facebook before they ever went public, they're the ones who made a fortune. And we created laws, by the way, after 1933, where we said, unless you have $1 million, you cannot invest in these type of private investments because we thought they were too risky. We didn't want people who didn't have enough money to be able to risk all of it. That was the concept. But in a way, there's a view today that somehow we have not just protected them from losing money, we've protected them from making money. And at the same time, we're sort of protecting the man, right? So there's this sort of subculture that's an elite that's been able to make all this money, and others haven't had access. And so what I think this president is trying to do is say, we want everybody to have the lottery ticket. The thing that that worries me is when everybody has a lottery ticket, most people who have the lottery ticket lose. That is the great conundrum of the lottery.
And the people who lose are often the people who can't afford to lose.
Yes, that's exactly right.
When you look at the big picture, what do you think is responsible for all these kind of big cultural and economic shifts that we're witnessing right now? If you had to put the pieces together, are they all the things that I mentioned in terms of the environment we're living in? Or, I mean, what forces are colliding right now?
So I think there's a couple of things happening. Start with the underlying issue of the human condition, which is we all want more. That's not capitalism, that's just
human nature.
Human nature. And you also have a group of people, financiers, who have a lot of money, who've been lobbying in Washington to allow for a lot of this to happen. So, crypto, which is, again, another seemingly speculative kind of thing to do. Those guys basically helped bankroll President Trump's election. And so that money's, they effectively paid for that access. And there are people, I do believe that the people who are behind all this genuinely do believe that this is good for America. Like, they do believe that letting the ordinary American invest in these opportunities, they call them opportunities, and they think they're a good thing. And by the way, they may turn out to be a good thing in the long run if you can keep all the guardrails around them. I think one of the great lessons of 1929 was you need guardrails. People left to their own devices will always want more, and we are not the greatest self-regulators of ourselves. We're just not.
There are no guardrails.
And that's the conundrum. I think right now, increasingly, the guardrails are coming off. The administration recently announced a plan where corporations, public companies, who used to have to report their earnings every quarter, 4 times a year, the president came out and said, you know what, you don't need to do that anymore. We want you to only do that twice a year. So again, less transparency. And the SEC looks like they're probably going to back that plan. So I think there's just a whole bunch of these types of things that are happening in this moment that are concerning.
Let's go back to 1929 and the aftermath. Following those few years, there was regulation.
Yes.
Talk about what happened, and do you view some of the measures as perhaps an overcorrection?
That's a great question. So one of the big things that happened, and one of the main characters in this book is a guy named Carter Glass, who
Glass-Steagall,
people know from Glass-Steagall. Carter Glass, though, was really like the Elizabeth Warren of his time, maybe AOC, but more like Elizabeth Warren. And for many years in the 1920s, he used to rail about this thing called Mitchellism in Charlie Mitchell. He thought people like Charlie Mitchell were going to ruin America because Charlie Mitchell was loaning people all this money. It was going to lead to all this speculation and upend the economy. And so there were a lot of laws that were put in place by people like Carter Glass, though, again, without giving away too much, how Glass-Steagall was actually put together even for me, and I think even some scholars who've read the book, is just like a shock. It's like completely at odds with what you'd think really happened. It's sort of a wild story. And so you had that happen. You had the creation of the SEC in 1934. By the way, Roosevelt, of course, comes into power in 1933. He goes after some of the banks, shuts down a lot of the banks. So there was a whole bunch of things. Is it an overcorrection? Probably to some degree, but was it too much? I mean, the good news is we've had other financial crises, 2008 being one of them, dot-com bust being another, but we haven't gone totally, off the cliff for a decade or more at a time. And the one thing I will say that was a bit of a weird lesson for me, we all think speculation's like a dirty word, right? You don't want too much speculation. But we all need a little bit of speculation, because speculation is like the twin of innovation. Like if you look and think about it, like Elon Musk and Tesla, somebody at some point had to speculate on Elon Musk early on when it seemed like an insane thing to do. It was a complete speculation. And you need that in the economy for there to be innovation. Otherwise, we're never going to get any of it. But the question is, sort of where's the line? And when does it become too much? And when does it become too much of a group think? I do think, by the way, we might be having a little bit of that.
Well, I was going to ask you, of course, when you said that, I'm thinking, okay, the AI bubble, right? And what's happening now. How do you think that's playing out, and how does it relate to some of the other groupthink disasters, honestly?
So I think the AI bubble is a bubble, and it will pop, but I think of it more like the dot-com bubble, which is to say, the internet came of age in the late 90s, and there was a pop, but the internet is still here and is more powerful and a bigger force than ever. So I think something like that will probably happen with AI, meaning there's definitely overinvestment and probably investment in the wrong areas, and so there will be some kind of comeuppance. I don't think that means that AI is not a thing. I think AI is probably a generational shift for everybody.
But there will be a correction.
There will be a correction. The question that we don't know this time around is if you believe that every financial crisis is a function of too much leverage in the system, too much borrowing money, right? In 1929, it was too many people borrowing for stocks. In 2008, it was too many people borrowing for subprime loans and the like. It could be that there's too much borrowing going on around these AI data centers. People don't appreciate, yes, Google and Facebook, they're all spending hundreds of billions of dollars. But to build these data centers, there's energy companies that are taking on an extraordinary amount of debt, construction companies, real estate companies. I mean, and that debt we can't see anymore. That's actually another big thing. It used to be that you'd get a loan from a bank, and so the system could see the debt in the system, the leverage in the system. Today, it's all moved into what they call the shadows, into this private credit business. And so we don't really know what's going on. And that's a little scary. And I'll give you one more little, not to scare everybody, but you're starting to see what they call round trip deals, these like circular deals where, so NVIDIA and OpenAI did this very unusual deal a couple weeks ago where OpenAI is buying chips like crazy from NVIDIA. But OpenAI can't afford to buy all the chips that it's committing to buy. It doesn't make money. It's losing money right now.
Right.
So what's happened? NVIDIA invests money into OpenAI. So they have now committed to give them $100 billion, which then they're going to take the $100 billion and buy the NVIDIA chips. So it's a completely circular transaction. It's like magic. And then just, I think 2 weeks ago now, a similar deal. OpenAI is going to buy chips from AMD. Can't afford to buy the chips in AMD. Says to itself, well, if we announce that we're going to buy chips from AMD, AMD's stock is likely to go up. So we're going to get a stake in AMD, and when the shares magically go up, we'll now have money from those, and then we'll go buy the chips.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it just reflects that there's not a sort of underlying stability in that market. When you get into what's called vendor financing, when the vendor basically has to finance you, it can come back to bite you. Now, yes, if OpenAI turns out to be a massive success and super profitable, maybe no harm, no foul. But if it doesn't, the whole sort of ecosystem can break. And right now, we're in this very weird moment in the stock market where, every time that a company announces they're going to spend more money, the stock goes up, doesn't go down. It used to be, if you fire people, the stock would go up because they're going to spend less money. They're going to invest less, stock goes up. This is like the opposite.
You say people aren't investing in the right thing with AI, so I'll bite.
Okay.
What should I be investing in when it comes to
So
AI?
it's not that you shouldn't be investing in AI. I think the way people are investing in AI right now is just to buy the big, shares in the big tech companies, NVIDIA.
And there are a lot of other smaller companies that are going to be important to the whole AI
And
environment.
Maybe. And that's another question. There's so many small startups that have been coming up around this whole ecosystem. Do they last? Do they not last? I don't know if we know the answer. The other piece of this that we haven't even got into, and maybe go back to 1933 and think about this. So we had unemployment in the country in 1933 of about 25%. It's kind of insane. 25%, a quarter of people were unemployed. If AI is successful, so if all of these AI companies, for them to be successful, they have to create more productivity. Companies are only going to pay for these services if they create more productivity for their company. Well, productivity is a euphemism, dare I say, for taking out cost, other cost. What is the other cost?
People.
It's human cost. It's people. So if this is truly a success, if they shoot the moon and this is really successful, at the same time that the companies may seemingly be successful, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to lose their job who won't be able to afford to use the services that these companies are going to provide.
Do you think anyone is thinking about that?
I think that there's a lot of people wearing blinders saying, let's hope for the best. I think there's a lot of hope. I don't think there's a lot of actually like modeled out spreadsheets that say, if you do this and this and this, it will do this. I think there's like a lot of hope and prayer taking place right now. And by the way, if you talk to a lot of the leaders in Silicon Valley today, they say, we are more scared of being behind.
Exactly.
And so therefore we're just going to, we're putting all our chips down.
It's China, right? As the president would say.
That's
what I feel like they are saying we cannot lose our competitiveness, and unintended or obvious consequences be damned. Honestly.
I think there's a truth to that. You look at some of these companies that are spending basically half to maybe, in some cases, more than all of their revenues. Literally, they're taking all the money and investing in AI. And maybe they'll be right. And by the way, as I said, I am sure that AI will be a powerful force, a huge powerful force on the other side of this. I just think along the way there will be a hiccup. And the question is, how big is the hiccup?
It's also kind of like globalization. Like nobody really thought about the long-term impact of a flatter world, as Tom Friedman would say. And this is kind of that on steroids, right?
It could turn out to be. Yeah.
Isn't that when the government is supposed to come in and say, whoa, everybody, let's kind of talk about the impact of this technology and let's kind of plan for it?
Yes, that's what the government is supposed to do. Having said that, we have both a broken government and we're in a rush. It's a combination of two things. It's that the government clearly, at least in this moment, I don't think you're going to get both sides talking on these issues. And the other piece is, and they're not wrong in this respect, if life is relative, you do need to care what the competitor's doing, and that is China. And if China is going full steam ahead and they're throwing all their chips down, maybe, at least the argument goes, we have to, otherwise we lose.
And what do you think?
And that there's like a permanence to the loss.
Right.
Right, that's the issue.
Where do you fall?
I think you could do a lot of what we're doing marginally slower without ultimately losing the game. I think we are still ahead of the game relative to China. And I think what you could say, what does that mean in practice? I think from a regulatory standpoint, instead of sort of opening up, all these new avenues for everybody to just, throw money at the problem, I think you'd probably do that part in a slower and more methodical way than we're doing it. And I don't think that would slow an OpenAI or a Microsoft or a Google down that much.
And that would give a chance for some of these other considerations to be
Well, the bigger considerations about employment,
right.
And
Well,
about
that's what I'm talking
yeah,
about.
no. If you really get into like what's going to happen with employment, I don't know what you're supposed to do
Or what's going to happen to our way of life, and should there be universal basic income, and how will
I think
our
we need
work
to be having those conversations. People are probably not. I mean, you've been having some of those conversations. Others have had those conversations, but it's not like a active conversation, in part because we don't know. So that's the other piece of this. We don't really know. And is it going to be a transitional period where we're going to have to sort of like transition from one thing to another, and that's going to be painful, but on the other side of the transition, we all figure it out and everybody learns how to use AI, and it makes us...
there will be a robot apocalypse, right?
Or there'll be a robot apocalypse, and people will be listening to this podcast, and we will be holograms.
Exactly.
Right? Like that might happen.
We should put this conversation in a time capsule.
I mean, the craziest thing, I don't know if you've played with like Notebook LM or any of these
yes,
models.
I actually just learned how to do that.
So, you can create a podcast. I have a son who now takes material from the internet that he has to learn, puts it into these models, puts his headphones on, and goes for a walk and listens to effectively a AI-generated podcast to teach him about, some of the classes that he's trying to learn. There's part of me that thinks that's super exciting.
I was going to say, I think
it's like
that's cool.
It's like a very cool thing, but it often, or I don't know if it's often, ultimately probably means we won't have as many teachers. And what are those people? I mean, I don't know. I don't know where this all heads.
I just think we should be thinking about it some more and hypothesizing about it some more.
So that we're in a better position to at least have thought about the debate when it actually hits us.
Yes.
Yes. I'm with you.
Do you know, I mean, if you had to name a person who's really talking about this, is there anybody?
Do you know Tristan Harris? I think.
Oh, yeah, I know him. I love him.
I mean, I think he's thought about this deeply in relation to social media and the impact of social media on society and democracy. I think he's increasingly spending time thinking about the impact of AI on society and humanity as well.
I interviewed him a couple of times, I think in 2018 when I was doing an hour for Nat Geo on tech addiction.
Right.
And I think he and I need to have another conversation now.
He's been
AI.
ahead of the game on all of this.
No, he has,
Yeah.
and he has been screaming from the mountaintops. The problem is there are not many voices like his out there.
And that's the thing about Cassandras. There's always a Cassandra in the room. By the way, in the late 20s, there were lots of Cassandras, people screaming from the rooftops, and nobody wanted to listen to them. And it's a very interesting thing just about humanity. When things are going gangbusters, nobody wants the party to end.
They're
it's
like,
the same thing.
la, 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 la.
Exactly. Always. But that's, by the way, think about the financial crisis in 2008. I remember 2003 and 2004, people say, I think there's a real estate bubble going on. Remember?
Yeah.
So, I'm not going to buy a house this year. I'm going to wait. It's going to fall next year. So I'm just going to wait. And the next year, you'd read a big article cover article about how there's a real estate bubble. You say, no, I'll wait another year. But you wait, and then it keeps going up. And then you say to yourself, okay, the train is leaving the station.
I better get on it.
I got to either get on the train or I'm never going to be able to get on this train. Of course, everyone jumps on the train right before it's about to hurl off the track.
Before we talk about today, because I want to ask you some things about President Trump, I do want to go back for a moment to talk about FDR and his role in all of this. Because, I admire, I stan FDR in modern day parlance. And I thought it was really interesting what you wrote about him. You said that even though handling the economy wasn't actually Roosevelt's strength,
It was not his thing.
somehow Americans grew to trust him anyway. And as the whole world fell apart, the United States fed off his abundant confidence. People were desperate to believe in something, and then you add they certainly didn't believe in money anymore.
That's true.
So just tell me what I don't know about FDR.
Well, so FDR, I don't want to say FDR was Trumpian, but FDR was kind of Trumpian. I mean, I think that there were people who just were believers. They really believed. I don't think that anybody would have told you that somehow FDR was some kind of financial genius or guru who understood how to deal with the economy. I think he saw a mess. It was a mess. I think he got a little bit lucky in terms of the timing of when he came in and the fact, frankly, that Hoover didn't make certain decisions he probably should have or could have in the year or two before Roosevelt arrived. And the country was sort of so psychologically damaged that they just wanted, they almost willed certain things to happen. And then, of course, the New Deal comes around. But that was not like an economic plan, really. Initially, there was so many other sort of social aspects to what he was trying to do, but it all happened to work. And then of course World War II comes along, and that helps economically too. So there's a whole bunch of things that I think we give Roosevelt a lot of credit. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve it. It happened on his watch, but I'm not sure it happened because he was, the messiah when it comes to economic activity.
Speaking of messiahs or lack thereof, let's talk about Donald Trump and his economic plans.
Yes.
Just 37% of U.S. adults approve of his handling of the economy, according to a recent AP NORC Center for Public Affairs poll. What do you make of that number, given that so many people look to him as a businessman, an all-knowing businessman, to set the economy straight?
So this, to me, is a complicated question. And more complicated maybe than you'd think, I don't know. The economy seems to be doing shockingly well, at least on the surface. Now, I would argue one of the reasons for that is this AI bubble. I think if you were to actually take the AI investment piece out of it and look at the rest of the economy, you'd say actually kind of lousy or not so great. And then you throw on the tariff piece that he's put in place, and you say to yourself, okay, that is creating more of a slowdown than we give it credit for. Because AI is powering so much of it, I think it's masking a lot of the other things that are happening.
But are you talking about the stock market or the
I'm talking about the stock market. I'm talking about the overall economy.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say AI bubble, people think, oh, AI bubble is like the NVIDIA stock. That's not what's happening here. The AI bubble is impacting the entire economy. So what's happening is companies are spending hundreds of billions of dollars. Those hundreds of billions of dollars are being used to build a data center or data centers all over. What does that mean? Someone has to buy new real estate. They have to go construct the data center. They have to create new forms of energy. So the energy companies, the electricians, the construction guys. I mean, this is huge amounts of, and obviously the chip makers. There's just so many pieces of the economy where people are getting jobs. Now,
and what about companies, too, that have to hire people to help understand how AI is going to impact their business? Is that contributing to it as well?
I think less on folk. I mean, I think there's a little bit of that happening. I think the truth is more people will lose their job in the short term from AI than the new people that are actually coming on. By the way, transform the stuff. And the truth is, a lot of this is a sugar high. So I would say, are we in like a gold rush or a sugar rush? Because you're going to build a data center, each data center is going to take hundreds of people to build. But once the data center is built, it could take 5 or 10 people to manage the data center. It's not like it requires thousands of people in each
So
place.
even if this is a bubble, though, Andrew, why do just 37% of people approve of his handling of the economy?
I think costs are going up. It feels like things are still more expensive. I think that's true to some extent. Though, by the way, to his credit, there's certain things that are cheaper than they used to be and other things that are more expensive than they used to be. I think people are just anxious and worried about, where we really are. And I think that in the areas where he said that he was going to make big changes, this is, in the industrial, sort of Rust Belt of America, I don't think you've actually seen the real changes. But we also haven't talked about, like, immigration's a big issue. If you don't have immigrants, that's a problem. There's a lot of sort of economic forces at play here between tariffs and immigration and everything else that I think we have to be thinking about. Having said that, one of the biggest shifts in this whole conversation, and this president has made it such, is they're now tying tariffs to national security. And that's a very interesting concept. By the way, that's a concept we were not talking about in 1929.
Interesting or scary?
I don't know. I'm not sure. So I'll tell you what I mean by when I say I'm not sure. If we didn't have tariffs on cars in America, there's a company called BYD in China that can make the cars better and cheaper than any car that's made here. We would have no automobile industry at all. You wouldn't make the car here. Just wouldn't happen. Is that okay? Is that acceptable? That there would be no automobile industry? If there was ever a problem where you couldn't get access to cars in China, would that be a problem? I think we did learn during the pandemic that you do need some form of resilience around drugs, around masks, around potentially cars and parts and all sorts of things. So I think there's like this very interesting question that we all have to resolve, which is, yes, we could get the cheaper product from other places and we could become a complete services economy, sort of like what the UK did. Or we could decide that we actually need to be making these products here. And if we're going to make these products here, then we got to figure out how we're going to do that.
And how we're going to compete.
And how we'd compete. I think we're not going to compete, by the way. That's the other thing. So all these tariffs are going to mean we're not going to compete. It is likely that 10 years from now, I was talking to the CEO of a big auto company, 10 years from now, we will pay more for lousier cars in America than most people will be able to get in other places. You'll go on vacation to Europe or to Asia or somewhere like that, and you will sit in the back of a car and think, wow, this is pretty great. We don't have things like this. Or we have things like this, but they cost so much that nobody has them.
And do you think Americans can tolerate paying more for crummy products?
That's the fundamental question.
Or less good products,
I think Americans
I shouldn't say.
don't. Here's the thing. We don't really like to pay more for things that say made in America. Most people don't. Most people don't seem to care. You see the little sticker in the back. It says made in China, made in America. Nobody seems to really.
Just give me the shirt I want and
give
make
me the
sure
best
I don't
product,
have to pay too much.
And I don't want to pay too much. And I think we as a country sort of have to come to grips with what that means.
And we could talk about like why are cars so much more expensive and lower quality in this country versus China.
Right. Because
we pay people to make them.
Because we pay people to make them. That's a huge part of it. We pay people to make them. And so we have to decide, do we want to pay people to make them? I mean, these are all of the sort of fundamental questions. But are we going to even need
people making them in the era of AI?
We may not, because the robots may ultimately make them.
My head is exploding.
Yeah, it's tough stuff.
How would you characterize Trump's economic philosophy? I wanted to ask Condi Rice. Andrew and I were at a conference recently, and Condi Rice was there. I wanted to have her characterize Trump's foreign policy philosophy. Unfortunately, I didn't get to ask her the question. So let me ask you, how would you describe his economic philosophy? It seems all over the place.
So I think there's actually one through line to everything the man does, which is he wants leverage over
everyone.
Everyone. Over people, over country. Where can he find the leverage? Where is the leverage point that he will have over somebody else? That is the entirety of the strategy. So when you think about, he went after the universities, for example, and said, I'm going to take your money away for science and other things. That was a lever. He looked and said, I don't like the DEI policies at universities. Do I have any leverage with these people? Well, I do, actually, if I take their science money away, right?
Or now their federal funding.
Or their
for
federal
all those
funding
schools.
away. Do I have leverage over China? Do I have leverage over Europe? Do I have I don't like the way Europe's treating American companies. Well, maybe
What do I have that they need?
What do I have that they need, and can I put the screws to them? And if I put the screws to them, will they then do what I want? I think that's the entire that is the strategy across the board.
As someone who knows the economy like the back of his hand, what are the pitfalls of running a country that way?
Well, it depends. This is a very interesting question. It depends how mercenary you think the world really is. So I think for the last 50 years, we've actually thought that we could be a role model for the world and that we wanted people to like us. And we did lots of things to make people like us. We let most of our economy be open. We tried to share our prosperity with others. We oftentimes were donating money to other countries and bailing them out and doing all sorts of things. And the question is, did that help us or not? He believes it did not help us. He believes we had no leverage over these people.
He believes...
And that they took advantage of us.
I was going to say that we got
Right.
screwed.
That we got screwed. I think it's hard to say we got screwed because I think the truth is we are still this great shining, hill.
Sitting on a hill.
Sitting on a hill. Thank you. We could also be a hill.
Yeah.
But, and I think we probably did get screwed in certain things, but I think on the whole we've done pretty well doing it this way.
And
So-
then this desire to have leverage on everyone. I mean, let's face it, it can also be very alienating to countries when we need them, right?
Well, that's going to be the big question. When we actually need them, what's going to happen? And I don't think we know the answer. Look, there's so many things where this president is just shifting and changing the way we've done things, taking stakes in companies.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. Can you talk about the government taking a 10% interest in Intel, because it is so unprecedented, and explain it to me, somebody who doesn't really understand the economy
Right.
that well, how this is so, needless to say, unconventional.
Okay, so historically, we claimed we had a free market. And the free market was such that, companies could succeed, they could fail, and the government was not an investor or playing a real role in this. Maybe they were
But
playing...
we did bail out companies,
Well, I was going to say, so
right?
we have bailed out companies, but typically there was a serious...
Crisis.
It was a crisis, and the reason for bailing them out in 2008 was we believed that if we didn't bail them out, it was going to have a wider effect on the economy. So here we are. Intel is struggling. We've decided as a country, or at least this president has decided, that chips and making chips in America is a super important thing to do. For national security reasons, most of our chips are not made in America. We need to start making chips in America. The Biden administration had given money to Intel as a grant, said, here's the money. We're not asking for anything in return. What we're getting in return is we'll have national security and we'll have more resilience because chips will be made here. But we're not asking for anything else. We're just handing you the money. Intel, to be honest, became a mess. It was probably a bad investment in Intel to start with, and became an even bigger problem. Intel needed more money, not more money, but needed the next tranche of the money that they were going to get. And this president said, you know what, this whole thing is so screwball. I want more. If I'm going to give you all this money, and instead of granting you the money just so you could have it,
What's in it for me?
What's in it for me? I want a piece of the action. And I want the taxpayer to have a piece of the action. So if Intel is going to do better over time, I want them to be able to have shares in the company. And if they do worse, by the way, we'll also lose our shares too. That's the conceit of what happens. The problem with doing something like this, in my mind, is it changes the dynamic once the government becomes an investor in companies, plural. So let's say Intel in the future wants to merge with another company. And normally, whatever that merger is, a regulator might say, you know what, this seems like really bad for customers. We don't want two of these big guys getting together like this. Well, how does that dynamic in that conversation change when you say to yourself, we actually own 10% of this company. And if we do this, we will do a lot better. Taxpayer will do a lot better. Customers may get screwed, but the taxpayers, the U.S. government that owns this will do better. So all of a sudden, it's sort of...
Well, we're seeing it with these mergers of media companies that play out in a different
right,
way,
in a different
right?
way. It just changes the whole dynamic with how everything gets played out, and it becomes political.
So do you see this happening more and more, or is this kind of a one-off situation?
No, you're having it happen right now with rare earths, these rare earth companies, which, again, we may need rare earths in this country to have great success. Should those be independent businesses? Should the government effectively subsidize them? If they do subsidize them, should they get money? I have one for you, and actually, because I think about this, and I actually do think it's a very interesting one. So one of the things that the Trump administration wants to do is right now the U.S. government gives grants to universities all the time, and scientists use that grant money, and they go off and they make amazing discoveries and
Right.
inventions. And the profits of those inventions And the patents for those inventions typically go to the scientist and the university that's behind them. Now, the money that was used to pay the scientist and the university came from you, Katie Couric, and me, and everybody in this room, and who's listening and watching, because we're the taxpayers. Historically, we have never gotten anything. We have had no stake in it. What we've gotten is the invention. We've decided that the invention unto itself is the benefit for our society.
Right.
Should we, like an investor would, get a stake in the patent? Because that's what the president is, that's the next place this is all going. They're going to go to the universities and say, look, you want this grant money? Great. If you have a great success creating CRISPR or the next great drug, the U.S. taxpayer should get a little bit of that money. And you would look at that and also in the context and say, okay, this government, I mean, we as a government or as a country are overspending and not taking in enough revenue. You have to figure out new ways to get revenue. That would be one way to do it. Is that good? Is that bad? The science community would tell you it's horrible.
Why?
I don't know.
Why would the science community be so against that?
Because they would say that they deserve the fruits of their labor, and that these are not inventions of the taxpayer, and that the American public is getting a great benefit.
Because it's life-saving work.
Because it's life-saving work.
What do you think?
I have totally mixed views of it. I don't know. I don't know if we said we want 10% of the action, whether that would change the dynamic with which the universities would do this work, whether the professors and scientists would not do this work or do it differently.
Go to a different country.
I don't know. That's the question.
Right now they're not getting the funding, so it's kind of a moot point.
But it's an interesting, but I'm just saying, philosophically, it's a very interesting concept. And irrespective of whether you think President Trump is a good president or a bad president, these are some of the ideas that he's throwing around, some of which I think at least merit a conversation about saying, okay, maybe this is good, maybe this is bad.
What about his sort of view of the Federal Reserve? I mean, it's very different. It's been a core guardrail for decades, and now he's pressuring, as you know. I mean, you probably talk about this every morning, Andrew. Jerome Powell trying to oust Governor Lisa Cook. Talk about the threats to the Fed's independence.
Right.
This is a different way of looking at the Federal Reserve. Right. Should it be an arm of the executive branch, or should it be
this
independent?
I have a much stronger view about. I think politics has to stay very, very far away from the Federal Reserve. And by the way, to bring it back oddly to 1929, one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve didn't do what it probably should have done in 1929, which was raise interest rates in a material way, was because they were worried about the politics of it. They were worried about the optics of it. The Federal Reserve was a new entity, started in 1913, and these guys thought, you know what, if we do something that damages the economy, meaning we try to clamp down on all of this, we're going to get hauled up in front of Congress. We may lose our jobs, but not just that. The Federal Reserve may disappear. This is not, now it's been around for a while, so people think it's supposed to be here. That was not the case back then. You do not want political pressure on the folks operating the Federal Reserve. You want them to be making a decision based on the math, frankly. And the second you think politics gets involved, at some point, I would imagine that investors around the world who invest and buy treasuries in America would say to themselves, you know what? Right now I pay X percent for the bond, and you have to give me this kind of premium because I trust you. But if you're going to politicize all this and I don't know what you're doing, I'm going to charge you more. And if they charge you more, it's going to cost all of us.
So the impact would be?
The impact would be that that our debt, the U.S. debt, would ultimately cost more. And that would be a problem because we don't have enough money to pay our debt as it is.
Donald Trump has, I think, kind of reimagined the presidency, to say the least. And I'm just curious, with everyone you talk to every day about very complicated topics, and I know your focus is on the economy and finances, but when you look at what has gone on, Andrew, I'm asking for a friend, and asking a friend from the time he went into office to now, and plans, and you hear things like plenary authority and
Right.
things like that uttered by Stephen Miller, and this, unprecedented power of the executive branch. As somebody who's covered so many administrations, on a scale of 1 to 10,
Yeah.
how concerned are you for the country?
7. And let me tell you why. I think you might be 10. I don't know.
Maybe I'm a little higher than 7.
But-
I don't know if I'm 10 now, but maybe.
But I'm going to tell you the thing that I grapple with, okay? So there are things that this president does that I think are completely unusual and problematic, and I worry about democracy, and I see the indictment of Comey, for example, and
Tish James.
and that is, to me, at least from the outside, feels like a weaponization of the system in a very bad way. Okay. And then I see this deal that was just made between Israel and Hamas, which seemed almost unthinkable. By the way, during the Biden administration, unthinkable. And potentially, if lasting, could have, a huge impact on peace in the Middle East. If that is true, it's and trying to balance and weigh these things against each other are harder for me than you'd think. And so I'm not ready to wave my hand and say it's all awful, and I'm definitely not ready to say it's all fabulous.
You're ready to say you have mixed feelings.
I'm at a 7.
Well, the book is called 1929, Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History and How It Shattered a Nation. It is going to make a great dramatic series
thank you.
for
We
someone
can hope.
somewhere, because the characters are so fascinating. And I think part of it, a big part of it, Andrew, is because you write it like a thriller. And it is so dramatic, and the characters are so interesting that they jump off the page. And I hope everyone buys it. And
From your lips. Thank you, Katie.
And I love talking to you.
I
Thank
do
you so
too.
much for
Thank you.
coming in.
I appreciate it. This is so much fun.